Ich dachte, ich mache einfach die Einführung netterweise auf Deutsch und dann wird Clare Lyster auf Englisch ihren Vortrag halten. Wir sind sehr froh, dass Clare Lyster aus Chicago gekommen ist und wird über, denke ich, vor allem, und darauf sind wir auch gekommen, auf Sie Learning from Logistics sprechen. Wir sind ja heute, für die, die jetzt erst eben gekommen sind, haben wir die logistischen Landschaften in Düsseldorf, Duisburger Raum abgefahren und haben da so einiges gesehen, was da für neue Dinge entstehen. Und Clare Lyster, und ich glaube, das ist wichtig zu diskutieren, sagt, wir müssen auf Stadt anders schauen durch die Logistik. Also es entstehen komplett neue Räume und das sind Situationen, die weniger über Gebäudehüllen, über Gebäude kommunizieren, sondern es sind eigentlich Relationen, das sind Flächen, das sind Landschaften, das sind Territorien, das sind Verhältnisse. Also über Zeit und Raum neu nachzudenken. Ganz kurz, Clare Lyster ist Architektin, geboren in Irland. Sie ist lehrt als Associate Professor an der University of Illinois in Chicago und sie schreibt and you will have a show at the Triennial in Lisbon. It will come or it's it's gone. Okay, it was okay. Also es gab eine Ausstellung in der Triennale in Lissabon. Und was wirklich interessant ist, weil es gibt sozusagen noch zwei weitere Theoretikerinnen in dem Feld der Logistik. Clare Lyster ist vielleicht die bekanntere, Deborah Cohen auch zu nennen. Es gibt sozusagen drei Damen in einem sehr männerdominierten Feld. Logistik ist, wie wir auch ein bisschen gesehen haben, eins, wo viele Männer unterwegs sind, und auch die Architektur ist normalerweise ein Terrain und auch die Stadtplanung ist normalerweise ein Terrain, wo immer noch die Männer sehr dominieren. Also sehr interessant, auch, dass sozusagen da auch möglicherweise eine andere Perspektive Einzug hält. Learning from Logistics bezieht sich ganz klar auf das Buch Learning from Las Vegas von Venturi Scott Brown, was jetzt nochmal in der Urausgabe von 72 wieder veröffentlicht worden ist und was auf Las Vegas, was damals so der Schrecken war, wie kann man sich nur diese hässliche Stadt anschauen, eine wichtige Analysestruktur war, die Bildbeobachtungen, Grafiken, Mappings und alle möglichen neuen Verfahren, Methoden, auch visuelle Verfahren einerseits genutzt hat und andererseits geschaut hat, welche Kommunikation, also welche Rolle Kommunikation und Symbole haben. Und das ist vielleicht ja auch ganz interessant zu sagen, dass Logistik ein auch nicht gerade auf der Hand liegendes Thema im Alltag erstmal. Also das ist ja auch ein Thema, wo wir uns auch ein bisschen abarbeiten, sozusagen zu überlegen, was kann man denn dafür lernen. Und ich denke für Stadtplanung, für ein Stadtverständnis. Und das andere, glaube ich, wichtige Buch ist von Castells, The Rise of Network Society, der auch ein linker Theoretiker, der 96, glaube ich, 96 Spaces of Flow, also neue Situationen in der Landschaft entwickelt hat und da, glaube ich, auch eine neue Perspektive von Stadtverständnis im digitalen Zeitalter gebracht hat. Ich würde jetzt die Vorstellung erstmal beenden. I'm very happy that you could come, made all the way with all the jet lags included. We are looking forward for your lecture, and then we have a discussion, and hope we learn not only from logistics but definitely from your lecture.
Thank you, Jochen. That was a wonderful introduction. No, I wanted to thank Katrine and Jochen and Esther and Anna, who have been my team here, both for organizing the event and for inviting me, and Anna for translating. It was a great day, and I think I went home this afternoon after Sergio's lecture last night, because I see this as not just me presenting a lecture, but this is part of a whole weekend discussion. And so I hope I can contribute to that in my own way. And so I will try to sort of link some of the discussions that might have come up in the post Sergio's lecture, but also in our bus drive today. I will start with just a little disclaimer. I know there was much discussion about the sort of labor relations and union or not union, and sort of the predatory tactics of some of these logistical systems. That's all very relevant. I'm not really going to get into that, and so, as Jochen said, the book is titled Learning from Logistics, and in the same way that the Venturis quoted Learning from Las Vegas, they went to Las Vegas, and yeah, it was, you know, they weren't sort of promoting the lifestyle of Las Vegas in their research. They were just using that as evidence to make a point that had some disciplinary relevance. And so that's kind of why the book is called that. It's the same disclaimer. I completely recognize that there's a lot of discrimination in the world of logistics. And just because I'm researching it doesn't mean to say I condone all of the politics involved, but maybe it might be better if we just kind of dispel that as we talk tonight. I'm just going to start this again because I have my timer on and I'll get mixed up. So just bear with me. Okay, now I'm at 0. I'm an architect by training. I'm a professor, but my project is kind of an urban project. In fact, I'm probably more recognized in the realm of landscape architecture than I am architecture, and that's probably because a lot of what I talk about is about systems and flows and things moving. And that sort of project is really more part of a kind of landscape architect's repertoire of thinking about the city. And so it's kind of, it moves across into the kind of discipline of landscape. But what I had been doing for maybe the last 7 or 8 years, I studied with Clare Lyster at Yale. So Katrine asked me earlier on how I got into logistics, and it was Clare sort of had a profound impact on me when I went to graduate school, and has been a sort of very close mentor since then. But I sort of had a very wonderful but very traditional education in Ireland, where you learned every Jim Sterling building and you drew that and you got an A if you could copy Jim Sterling, and I wasn't very good at that. And then when I went to Yale to study Keller, she kind of just opened this whole other way of thinking about space, and to me seemed much more relevant for what was going on today than perhaps a more traditional toolkit for learning what the architect does in the world, or how the architect kind of reads the urban environment. And so I began to look at the sort of mechanisms of flow, and this image, and whether this is flows of people. This is Aaron Coblin's image from 2005, where he's visualizing airline routes across the US over a 24-hour period. And it's kind of really interesting because you can see the big cities, the whole country is completely legible in a drawing that's lines. And so that was a kind of really interesting kind of and then I started to look at other flows in the world. So if it's people, it's also goods. I began to look at communication systems, began to look at data systems, and started to kind of think of all of these things together. And I'm remembering one of the comments in the DHL warehouse this morning when somebody asked the guy that gave the tour, what's your worst nightmare? And he says, when my data systems go down. And it makes you think how integrated sort of communication is with the previous images. I also began to kind of then try to understand these flows and try to understand them from the perspective of design. And then I began to look at the sort of platforms that make these flows work. And this is probably, it's my favorite image. It's probably for me the image that symbolizes the 21st century so far. This is the barcode that, as you all know, sort of a graphic of black and white lines that reads information, that basically allowed scanners and computers to digitize inventory systems. And we'll come back to the barcode in a little bit. And then I began to say, look at who are the agencies or the actors, I call them, that manage these flows or curate these flows. And many of these are corporations. And so I began to look at FedEx. The three on top were the kind of what I call the anchor flows in the book. FedEx, which is the kind of US version of DHL. I began to look at Amazon, and then I also began to look at Ryanair in the logic that those top three corporations looked at the flow of goods, information, and people, and that kind of encompassed kind of pretty much what I was interested in. And then, of course, began then just to collect pieces of information. These are kind of the cameo appearances of many of these other actors, corporate flows that you use every day. You might not use all of them, but you interact, whether you know it or not, or whether you're conscious or not, with many of these logistical actors on a daily basis. And that became really interesting to me. And often we use many of these systems and we have no clue. You know, I use the analogy of the FedEx box, or if it's a DHL, you put the envelope in a drop box at 11 o'clock at night, and you don't care who picks it up, you don't care how it gets there, once it reaches its deadline on time. And so we've become very used to interfacing with these flows without fully understanding the implications. And the implications are wide-ranging. The implications mean that there is now, we register, and Sergio touched on this last night, we start to register the built environment, the space around us through time. And again, you're not cognizant of your FedEx envelope traveling from New York to LA. You're cognizant of it needs to be there for a meeting at 7:30 a.m. in the morning. So even we start to move away from metric ways of calibrating space to temporal systems. And you can sort of talk about the history of industrialization since, you know, the cotton mills in Manchester through a kind of an analysis of time-space mechanisms. And as this diagram tries to kind of illustrate, as we have moved through history with faster transportation systems, that time-space relationship is shrinking to the point where some might say now time has overcome space. There is no space anymore, it's just time. The second implication that is interesting to me is a representational one. Architects draw the city. That's one of the fundamental things that we do as disciplinarians. And the image on the left, which is a series of drawings of Detroit, the figure ground drawing is the kind of the MO of architecture. That is kind of our training is so ingrained with this drawing. And then you kind of start to think, well, that method of drawing is no longer really useful to us when we start to think about all these dynamic systems. So there's a kind of a conundrum in the discipline is that suddenly the skill set where we have is no longer productive as a way to kind of think about the city. The image on the right is an image you're probably all familiar with. It's not a new image, it's from the 1950s, was Louis Kahn's map of Philadelphia. And for me, why this image still stands out as being a kind of paradigmatic image is that he's drawing the city, but he's not drawing buildings. He's not drawing big building figure. He's drawing the city from a notational system, which is arrows, dots, dashed lines, and he's trying to represent traffic flow. And so that's still, you can, the notion that you can draw the city without building figure is kind of an interesting lesson. or that we can think of the city as a completely dematerialized artifact. And so over the past few years, my method is sort of I read, I do some real kind of journalistic research, and then I try to sort of synthesize that in some cases in exhibitions or through drawings. This is an image from Google Pro, which we now can use open source. This is just for me, this is the contemporary city. This is a close-up view of the FedEx super hub at Memphis International Airport, which is the kind of the main hub, the global hub for FedEx. And at one point, every package, no matter where you were in the world, would go to Memphis to get rerouted. And the joke used to be is that you would like send something maybe sort of like from Chicago to Milwaukee, but it would actually go to Memphis and it could get there quicker. And for me, what's so fantastic, and it's a little washed out, is that you start to see the kind of, the evidence of mobility is kind of captured on the surface of the image, whether it's the containers in motion or the way the ground is coded with paints and lines and directions for the sort of manhandlers of the system. And then that's kind of an image of the inside of that sort of center that FedEx gave me for the book. And then I kind of augmented that drawing, or the image with this drawing. We looked at flight tracking software, you know, where you can just get like an Excel sheet of all the flights coming in and out of an airplane, rather like how Aaron Copeland did the first image I showed. This made me think of today when we went to the DHL, everyone's like, where's all the packages? Where's all the people? Where's all the action? The place was empty at, what, 10:30 a.m. this morning. And I completely understand that is because those facilities operate under extraordinary extremes. It's either crazy busy or there's nothing happening, and there's very little in between. And this kind of drawing of the FedEx Super Hub, so the purple are all the planes coming in, the orange are all the planes coming out, and the gray and the yellow peaks are when everything starts to happen. So you can correlate at certain times of the day. There's incredible intensity, and at the FedEx Super Hub it's at nighttime, because again your package that's gone into the mailbox goes to Memphis, and everyone wants their package delivered at 7 a.m. the next morning. So there's intense choreography at that facility between 11 and 3 a.m. the next morning. There's something like an airplane landing every 30 seconds over that 4-hour time frame. But again, what does the lesson here is that the kind of, the logistical city operates under kind of extreme conditions of stress and emptiness, and that was kind of an interesting kind of lesson for me. And then, of course, because you know, I'm sort of a designer, there's how do you start to kind of maybe think about interesting ways to show this phenomenon. And so this series of images, this was at the Lisbon Triennial, was the image, the drawing, and a model that was made up of 96 laser-cut acrylic sheets that are jammed together and with an LED light to make this kind of object. Again, you're abstracting the information, but again, it falls within a kind of a new way to represent the city, and these are the different templates before the acrylic was cut. The other thing that I'm interested in is the kind of cultural implications of logistics, and the sort of what I call, how do we, what I call as the logistical subject. Let's say if Benjamin talked about the industrial subject, or the flaneur was his kind of quintessential character of his era that he used as a way to kind of spin his theory. For me, it's the kind of the logistical subject, which could be the freelancer, or you know, there's different characters. Understanding that person in space. And then, of course, this is one of my favorite images, understanding not only the urban implications, but the architectural implications, and sometimes the comedic kind of aspect of our lives at the moment, the kind of ridiculousness of it all. I mean, you have to kind of look at it and sort of laugh sometimes at our expectations on what we think we need and when we need it and how it's supposed to get there. So there's also an attempt to kind of maybe not take the research too seriously and see where that spins you. As Joachim said, Manuel Castells kind of travels in German and English, I heard you mention. For me also, the motivation for the research was when I was conducting, like say, seminar classes at where I teach, I would look at my bibliography and I wouldn't have any architects on my bibliography. And I was kind of going, why is it all the texts we were reading, and when I mean we, I mean us that was in this way of thinking about the world, we were reading anthropologists, economists, Castells, Apadori, Sasson, even maybe Keller was the only sort of architect in the mix, and you know, you wouldn't really describe Keller as a kind of old school architect. And so it made me think, is there's a problem in our own discipline if we have to go outside to read about the contemporary city. That means we're not sort of fulfilling our job. So all of those things came together as a kind of motive to write the book, which maybe you could say is kind of like a manifesto for the contemporary city from the perspective of the space of flows, to use Castell's terms. And so I'm just very quickly going to talk about the structure of the book, and then I'm going to focus on one chapter, which I think Katrine had mentioned that one of the chapters might have kind of more traction for the discussion than a kind of broad survey of the book. The book is divided into these kind of 5 lessons, and at some point I moved away from, you know, there's a chapter on FedEx, there's a chapter on Amazon, kind of dissertation style, to sort of structuring the book under what I call very traditional categories of urban thinking: site, plan, zone, circulation, and architecture. They're sort of terms that have been around forever. And so then the kind of began to spin the research through those 5 categories. So for instance, chapter 1 on site is urbanism after geography, the network is context. Chapter 2 is about the plan, double vision, total design, total choice. Zone, split-second city, time as a vehicle of urbanism. Chapter 4 is the one I'm going to talk about. Urbanism on demand, the city as service platform. And the chapter on architecture is actually really not about architecture. It's a very depressing chapter. Smart landscape done building, ground rules, and the logic that maybe landscape has superseded architecture as the primary discipline to look at the city. And then at the end, because, and maybe what distinguishes me from Keller and Deborah Cohn is that I wanted to kind of have, not necessarily design projects, but just some scenarios that started to kind of speculate on the research in the book. And so I called that Apply. So the introduction tries to, I'm going to just go through this really quickly, tries to kind of provide a prehistory of all, not all, of some of the sort of systems that I felt were valuable or invaluable to the kind of logistical project. And so this is the early patent for the barcode. The actual early patent for the barcode was a bullseye diagram from the 1950s. And what's really interesting about all of these technologies, they all began in the 50s and kind of, you know, post-World War II think tanks at MIT and various institutions, and then came out of the institution and into culture in the 1970s. So for me, and I don't know, Sergio, what sort of, you know, where the logistics 1, 2, 3, 4, the 1970s kind of falls, but for me the 1970s marked the logistical systems as a cultural project as opposed to just merely a technological one. And so, for example, the barcode only becomes interesting when it's put on a pack of juicy fruit gum in 1974. The sort of early APRNet systems only become interesting when they're starting to be tested in the early 70s. Computer chip technology is only interesting when it becomes, when Intel designs the Intel 4004, which basically meant a computer went from being the size of a room to being a desktop size, and it meant that computational systems could now become accessible to the general public. Some of you might remember this. Pong was one of the earliest consoles, gaming consoles, that you had to go to an arcade to play in a kind of plastic little machine. It was the early sort of interface between gaming technology and entertainment that now we take for granted. And then, of course, I looked at JIT systems, which had already been in the kind of auto industry in Japan and came to the US, I believe, in the mid to late 1970s after somebody translated a paper on JIT systems at the Detroit Auto Show in 1975, and it began to be incorporated into the auto production in the US. The logic that you could have a completely lean system. There was no waste, and things would arrive on the assembly line when they were needed. The last thing I look at again as the prehistory was SABRE. I think it's an acronym that American Airlines developed with Intel in the 1960s, which basically became the first public central reservation system. And what it meant is that you could go to a travel agent, you would give them your name, they could reserve you a seat, your address and emergency information and where you were going was all recorded in one place. And that was the kind of first, and for me that's a kind of a precursor to the kind of immense centralization of information that we now associate with the likes of Amazon and Facebook and Google, but that this was the kind of precursor for that. Moving on to the kind of chapter 4, and I've introduced more recent stuff, so this is not like just an index of that chapter in the book. Urbanism on Demand, the City as Service Platform. I'm going to read that because I can't read it here and it's kind of blurred for you too. So all of the chapters kind of have this sort of like pull quote that sort of summarizes the main thesis of each chapter. And this one says, the reality of post-Fordist culture is that services have replaced things. The city must no longer be conceived as a purely formal artifact, but instead akin to a platform, a communication system that is generated by synergies between hard infrastructure, information systems, and architectural space that supports the range of routines, lifestyles, and experiences that globalization has to offer. So this word platform, which has been thrown around a lot in kind of contemporary urban scholarship, how do you start to use that word to think about the city? And so that's what this kind of chapter is about, and that's what I'd like maybe to talk about now. And so I began to sort of like, like your phone is a platform, all your computational devices are platforms. It's a device or a system that allows you to do something, or it brings something to you. And so it's kind of interesting to think about the city like that. So I began to look at Amazon, which might be like the kind of Uber platform, and started to look at like a lot of research on the spaces of Amazon, started to look at how Amazon works. This is a zoning diagram of which keeps changing, but how best to place items in the warehouse so that the picker, and they still use pickers as in like employees, not just robots, so that they can pick things for an order in the quickest amount of time. And so they came up with this kind of batch system, which meant that they have a constant feedback every day of the most popular items that people are buying. And so they move all the popular items into clusters. So, you know, you don't want to send someone off to buy something like obscure that somebody is only ordering once in a blue moon. And so they kind of started to think about the warehouse under this kind of zoning idea of batches, where all the popular things were close to the person who was picking them. And of course they're doing that on algorithms, and so there's a computer deciding and giving a printout or a kind of a digital printout to the picker to calculating the picker's fastest route to pick the items. And the picker is not picking goods for your order. They're like, everyone that wants a coffee pot today, you'll pick that, or everyone that wants something else. The products are assembled into customer order later in the process. And again, as Jochen said, you know, drawing that process, how that works from, you know, ordering on your computer, going to the cloud, feeding into a computer at the Amazon database, an algorithm being calculated, sent to the picker, picking the item, packing the item, distributing the item, and so forward. And then looking at recently in the US, Amazon's latest thing is to promise 1-hour delivery in major cities if you order by a certain time of day. I'll talk about that a little later because that's kind of marking their next phase of warehouse development in urban areas. But in addition to the spaces and the infrastructure, you know, which is, you know, a truck is not exactly high tech, what made Amazon kind of a really interesting case study was they were one of the first online companies to make a website that was accessible to the public. And this is back in the 1990s, when, if you read the story of Amazon, you know, there's kind of funny, Jeff Bezos is in his garage with floppy disks of like people's names and addresses. I mean, starting off on the really, really fundamentals. And what was so interesting about Amazon's website was that it was designed as a graphic interface, but it was designed as a kind of public space. And that was their idea from the get-go, that you would come here and that even the icons, the shopping cart, and the way it was graphically designed was a way of bringing the city to you. And so the website was one of the kind of early platforms. Up until then, websites in the kind of early 90s were black and white, were sort of very, very scientific looking. And then they began to sort of add chat stations. So if you bought a book, you could say, oh, you know, reviews, you would like this, and sort of slowly building up a kind of public space around their website. And so that, to me, was a good example of a platform. And since then, the idea of the platform has expanded into, and this is a kind of line of research I'm doing at the moment, a whole plethora of gadgets, or what Rainer Banham calls gizmos, that again you use every day. Some of these are Amazon patents, others are just collected. But these are the things that makes the logistical city work, or these are the things that makes kind of interfaces between you and that bigger world of the port that you went to see today, which is kind of an abstract space. And so for the Seoul Architecture Biennial last year, I wanted to make a list of all the things that we use or are required to sort of help you interface with logistics. And this was kind of a huge mural that was on a wall in the exhibition. And then a little history about each of these gadgets. So it went from satellites to the conveyor belt to a cardboard box, to some of these, to Netflix, to a container ship, and so on. So what I call the kind of stuff of logistics. And then what we did was, and this is not reading very well because of the line work, this is just a really, I'm going to talk over this. You'll start to see some lines appear on the drawings. So this is the data line. This is very faint, I apologize. So what we started to do was, let's take some themes and start to kind of make links between the different artifacts. So this is shopping. So the green line is all the things that you need to do your online shopping. Oh, that's better. The pink is like all the stuff that you need to do socializing. And so it's making connections between the different artifacts. The orange is everything you would need to sell something online. Like now you can go on and use eBay and all of this stuff to sell. The purple is about the kind of protocol behind shipping. And then I think there's one more, they're all together. Dining, we started to look at sort of food delivery systems and how they work and what sort of devices are in the world to make that happen. sharing economy, sort of starting to make links between things that are required for the sharing economy. Streaming media. And then this is kind of like putting them all together. And so this was on a big projector over the mural. What the video tries to do was to kind of say, this is the platform city. And that again, our notion of a city is that it's a physical built place, and that urbanity is only possible in that realm, and that this kind of bankrupts that notion and the logic that the city there's other forms of urbanity out there that perhaps we can embrace. And they're coming to you. Sorry. And so then I began to kind of look for other evidence of some of these platforms, which is kind of hard, because that's, again, the log port today, which I didn't really see, but I know what it's about. You're not going to go to an intermodal rail yard every day. In fact, you're probably an anomaly. Most people will never go in their whole lifetime. So many of the spaces of logistics are kind of removed from how we interface with the systems. And so what I've been trying to do, as courtesy of this theme platform, is to find evidence of more everyday spaces in the city that might make the link. And so one of these was Peapod is one of the larger grocery delivery chains in the US. It's actually based out of a place near Chicago. So you go online, you order your groceries, they come to you. And so a few years ago, they began this virtual shopping aisle as a test in a train station in Chicago. But Tesco had already sort of patented that system in Seoul, where you could snap, you have an app and you use your phone and it goes straight to your account, and your groceries are delivered usually not long after you get home. But again, this Seoul is actually a very interesting case study because of the density of the city, the population, and their sort of work habits. They work very long hours, and they're all very phone savvy or techno savvy, and so a lot of these logistical systems are actually up and running in a city like Seoul, and are sort of more familiar than they might be to some other cities. I mentioned FedEx before. Just at a very mundane level, the FedEx box is a platform that you see every day, or it might be the DHL one. But now the FedEx box is found in business lobbies and hotel lobbies, and it's kind of starting to kind of permeate into other spaces of the city. Then I made a little map. You can see this is the line mark is Manhattan. I tried to kind of say where would be the densest sort of field of FedEx boxes in the world. So I looked at Midtown Manhattan between like 59th Street and 50th Street. And sure enough, that's the kind of density within a 1 mile area of FedEx boxes. The Amazon pickup, and again, I don't know what his name was, the guy at DHL today was talking about the DHL pickup station. How they're using those as a kind of alternative mechanism to solve some direct delivery problems. The Amazon pickup station is getting pretty popular in the US, and again, you get an email to say your package has been left and you can come pick it up. And I'm collecting more and more of these sort of spaces. And then it was funny today on the taxi back to the train station in Duisburg. We all think that the logistical city just happened 10 years ago, and all of these systems kind of suddenly came into being. But if you kind of look back in history, logistics is really just the latest phase of industrialization. And so I began to kind of then look back and trying to trace this idea of the platform in history. And some of these systems might be more familiar to you, looking at the pneumatic mail system, which was very popular in Berlin and other German cities, in Paris. This is the London map, and this is the terminal in London, where for a period of time you would put a note in a little tube, and it would be kind of pushed through with these kind of levers in little tubes under the ground. Incredibly efficient, incredibly fast. They've gone out of fashion. And then picking up some kind of more sort of funnier examples. This was Modern Mechanics, is a kind of technology museum that has kind of spit on new technological inventions. And the image on the left is looking at using the pneumatic tube system to shoot meals to the home. So this is an idea in the 1930s, you know, where the lady of the house, it was all like related to the liberation of women. The lady of the house is no longer in the kitchen, but she's in her lovely outfit, she's working and she's on the phone ordering the food for the kind of family for the dinner, and it would come through this system. But again, you know, that's like 80 years ago, that there was cognizant that these systems could go over and beyond what they were doing to sort of serve other uses. I began to look at, being from Chicago, we could do a whole lecture on Chicago, which is probably the most fantastic logistical city. It's the logistical city of the industrial era because it was a hub for the railroads. Everything in the US came in and out of Chicago. And one of the things that made Chicago so, let's say, pivotal in delivery systems in the late 19th century was the mail order catalog industry. Again, we think Amazon is a new invention. This was as smart as Amazon. In fact, it was smarter than Amazon because it didn't have the information systems to do everything for them. And it was centered in Chicago. And they would then issue this catalog every month or every first season. There would be a Christmas catalog, a summer catalog. And people in rural areas could order from the catalog, and whatever you needed was shipped to your local train station. And so it was a mechanism, again, it was a platform in those eras for providing access to new products to the rural agricultural landscape. These are some old slides of the facility in Chicago. I think when it was built, it was the largest industrial facility in the world. It was built in 1909. These are some images of the inside. Incredibly sophisticated in terms of how it was worked. Everything was kind of gravity fed in the building. And there was train tracks under the facility to bring the products out. As a result, speaking of post office, the post office that served this in Chicago, the building is still in Chicago, it's no longer used for post office, was the biggest post office in the world for 25 or 30 years because of all the processing that was associated with the mail order catalog. And then, of course, also trying to trace, you know, I'm not the first kind of person or architect to think about this idea of a platform. And then what other architects have been kind of pursuing ideas that we could kind of learn from them. And, you know, many of the sort of references that are in the book, and this is not intentionally, oddly enough, come from the kind of radical projects of the 1960s, from, you know, the kind of super studio Archizoom, Archigram in the UK, where you had firms speculating on the technological systems of their era, in this case computational systems, electronics, radio and TV systems, or work of Cedric Price, where he's like using TVs and screens to kind of rethink institutional projects. And so this, for me, is an example of a platform. This is Archigram's Instant City, which was really the form of this blimp that would arrive, and to quote their words, sleepy English towns of the kind of 1960s that were kind of away from the kind of cool London scene. And these blimps would bring all the stuff that that city didn't have. And it was kind of like the circus coming to town, basically. So the notion that this would infiltrate the city and then take over, and even if it went on to the next lazy town, its legacy would be a kind of switching the kind of culture of that place, you know, for good or bad. I was also looking at, again, super studios. Super surface for me is also an idea of a platform. That's the image on the right. Their idea that that technology could completely dematerialize the urban environment. So we didn't even need buildings anymore, and instead you would have you would plug into a network, and that was all that you needed to sort of live your life, and that this network in their renderings, as you know, is all pervasive. It exists throughout the world, and that it allows that the subject of this world is the kind of urban nomad. That technology means that you could go anywhere, do anything at any time, and you would be perfectly happy. That was the kind of the idea. And then the image on the left, oddly enough, is an older, maybe I should have had that first, these are not in chronological order, is Edgar Chamlis's Road Town from 1909. Just fantastic idea for a city on a rail line, so that's the kind of only image rendering of the project. This is a diagram that I made of the project to understand it. This was a kind of an alternative city to the sort of industrial city in the US at the turn of the century. And so rather than moving out to the kind of rural area, the suburbs, you would live on a train line, so you could come in and out of the city if you needed. But he had fantastic ideas about how you would live here. You had your own plot of land. If you were resident in this kind of duplex system, you're not moving, you're in your duplex. You had a farm of land, so it was something about kind of sustaining yourself. But he had like bundled infrastructure. You ate at communal kitchens, and the dirty dishes would go on a conveyor belt to kind of the disheries, they were called, and get cleaned. And all sorts of kind of things moving in this linear city that sort of enabled you to kind of work on your plot of land, or sort of invest in sort of maybe higher thinking ideas. But again, just really, really kind of sophisticated way about thinking of this idea of platform over 100 years ago. And then more recently, the other notion of the idea of platform has been tested in many of the projects, again, of the 60s, where you had the user could customize his or house unit for himself. So you had like Kenzo Tange's project for Tokyo, where you had sort of an infrastructural system that then there was modules that you could plug in the capsule house. There's a whole kind of range of those, from the Metabolist to Archie Graham, as a way to think about customizing space. So that was the other kind of way of thinking about the platform. The image on the right is Friedman's Flat Writer, which was basically like a computer program from the 1960s that enabled the user, he's looking at the kind of the lattice structure that exists over Paris, that you could then start to infill that structure by virtue of entering your information into, it wasn't even a computer, it was like a typewriter that he had kind of customized. And these were the kind of outputs. He's kind of sketching the outputs that this computer, how the computer would respond to your input. But again, a really early way of thinking. That's what Amazon does now. It's like, it's all about you. You choose, what do you want, when do you want it, where do we want it delivered. The notion that the individual perhaps has become maybe more important, and I'm not saying that that's good, is evident like even 50, 60 years ago. So again, and then the system operated on feedback mechanisms that if you entered information that was in conflict with perhaps your neighbor, the computer would tell you, no, you can't do that because of such and such reason. In terms of moving maybe to the closer scale, thinking about the platform at the scale of a kind of residence, in Gideon's fantastic book, Mechanization Takes Command, he talks about how in the teens, the zeros and teens, 19 zeros and teens, that the sort of production mechanisms in factories started to kind of come into the home. And the streamlined kitchen was the kind of paradigmatic example that he uses. This is Ude's design for the Wiesenhof, and the logic that the house could now be more like the factory. And it was designed and considered based on efficiency, based on simplifying the labor process. And of course, in Gideon's case, there was a kind of political agenda where, again, you were eliminating the woman of the house from the kind of slavery of kitchen chores for her to do other things. But again, the streamlined kitchen for me is an example of a kind of platform in history. And then more recently, this is Ugo della Pietra's Casa Telematica for the 1972 the show at MoMA, New Domestic Landscapes, where he's starting to think about the house as part of a kind of larger network, which is kind of illegible at the scale of this drawing, and starting then to kind of understand spaces in the house and the kind of relationships in the house, a more avant-garde approach to that, based on the house as no longer being considered a single entity, but part of this larger system. The image on the right is a contemporary version from an architect in Chicago. Metropolis magazine ran like the house of the future, and again, looking at a kind of, this is the living room, you know, where everyone is sort of in their cocoon seat with their phone, and then the kind of digitized surface in their midst. And then the last example I have in that chapter, and since I'm in Germany, is Bureau Landschaft, the kind of, which were an interior design firm that did a lot of offices out of Hamburg in the 60s. And this is a kind of floor plan. So the notion of the office floor plate as a, you know, the corner office and all the desks in a row and everything organized and kind of hierarchies. This is the floor plan that they would produce based on network systems of the 1960s, fax machines, public address systems, telephones, and the notion that the network in the office scenario completely eroded the kind of traditional hierarchies that had been in place in the kind of corporate environment. And there's, you know, even just amazing floor plans. Now, you know, on the one hand, it looks fantastic, the kind of chaos that we're kind of reading from the image. But in actual fact, they had real kind of strict diagrams behind these clusters of spaces based on adjacencies, based on network conditions, or based on where the phone was between a group of people and so on. But again, just like a completely different result. So that's the kind of platform research and study. And then just very quickly, I wanted to kind of just run through a couple of design projects that perhaps try to test this in practice. And some of these take the idea of platform maybe broadly, but I just thought that I would just show you a few design projects. So how do we then respond to the kind of logistical era as designers? We can leverage these systems to kind of maybe make the city better. We can embrace them. That might be problematic because you don't want to be seen as, let's say, you know, what's the going to bed with the devil or something, or sort of, you know, not offering any resistance. is what I'm trying to say. Or you can be completely critical of the systems and kind of propose an alternative view of the world. This one tries to leverage them. This is a site in Chicago. This is a hole in the ground that was built in 2008 to receive the caissons for a Santiago Calatrava building that when 2008 came, banks fell out, the project developer went burst, and the project was cancelled. And so 10 years ago, the hole is still there. The building hasn't been, thank you, nothing has been developed. And so there was like a Chicago magazine, kind of asked a couple of young architecture firms, what are we going to do with the hole? So everybody proposed some interesting ideas for the hole. So I had been doing, I think I was writing the chapter on data systems, and I had been looking at data storage centers, and like as a logistical space. And the interesting thing about data storage centers is they want to be in a kind of central area, because the closer you are to the data center, the kind of better your service, or the quicker your service is. You know, which is why the big e-trading firms actually moved out to New Jersey to be not beside the NASDAQ and Wall Street anymore, but beside the data center that hosted the information for the NASDAQ, for the traders. And so we put a data storage center in the hole because on the one hand, the data storage center wants to be hidden, but on the other hand, it wants to be central. So how do you be in the middle, in a busy area, but also be hidden? And then, of course, the problem with the data center is that it's it's not a very, let's say, environmentally sustainable space. And so, but because we were near the lake, I'm just going to skip an image. We said, well, you could cool the space with water coming in from the lake, and that the hot water that is then the result of the cooling process goes up to the top and makes this hot tub, which is a public hot tub in the middle of the city. And then you start to kind of be the designer, you berm up the edges, you put some public program, and you have this amphitheater. And then that is used to kind of catalyze the site. So you're leveraging the data center to do more in the city. And then the landscape around the hot tub is orange. Orange is the color, is the industry color for fiber. I don't know if it's that in Germany. So if you see the pavement tagged with yellow spray, you know the telecommunication company is coming to dig it up. If it's pink, it's electricity. If it's something else, it's water. So the landscape is orange as a kind of way to sort of hint at what's underneath. And then the logic is that you could be sitting in this hot tub and you're scrolling your Instagram photos that might actually be stored in a server underneath, but that you're not you don't even know that. But then just using that to make a kind of urban space in the city. Another project is under the issue of what I call solve. This came up this morning in the DHL. I think, again, the gentleman said that they want to be closer to where everyone is. And so the logic that they want to have some of their facilities in very urban areas, or they're now getting bike messengers to go into kind of city center where it's a little easier. So this one was based on Amazon also. As a way to make their 1-hour delivery work, they are building new fulfillment centers in urban areas within a 75-mile radius of large populations. And so the logic is, well, maybe you wake up one morning and there's a dirty big warehouse at the end of your street. You know, the logic that these buildings are cheap. There's lots of design in them on one hand. This is Keller's thing, but there's no design in the way we think about design. And so this was again, sorry, this is a bit washed out, where you would have your big warehouse, and you line the warehouse with housing. So if you're living on that street, you just see houses. Again, you don't know what's behind it. And then you put some public program on top, and then only one, so the project was called Five-Sided City, only one side, then the one facing a kind of highway or infrastructure is the dock with all the bays for the trucks that we saw today. So the idea that you would, if you were a kind of super online enthusiast and you wanted something in the quickest possible time, that you could live in the house, and that kind of moment where you could kind of open a door in this poche wall and you would get your delivery, but that you're living on the edge of the warehouse. And again, I became interested in what I'm looking into now is the kind of aesthetics of logistics. And I looked at the kind of, this is an abstraction of a floor plan of an Amazon fulfillment center that we then use to design the park on the roof. And again, that zoning idea, the zoning diagram, the batch diagram that I showed you earlier, is now used to kind of organize the park, and the logic that popular things, in this case program, would be located, distributed throughout the park in these batches. And then the kind of circulation system starts to kind of mimic a warehouse interior. So you're borrowing the kind of aesthetics of logistics to kind of maybe do something different, and then a kind of zoom. And then the logic that if you didn't live on the edge of the warehouse, there would be new typologies of high-rises in the other part of the city that is really all based on delivery systems. Again, kind of, I mean, this is not completely unlike the kind of layered, you know, the images, Hugh Ferris images of Manhattan skyscrapers in the 1910, where they would subdivide the city into different network layers. And so this is the bottom of your high-rise, and there's robots dropping off stuff to large storage spaces, and the high-rise has an expanded system of elevators, and then the top image, again it's a bit washed out, is kind of these services landing at your kitchen. And that's kind of, the house is reduced to a kind of mechanized version. Also looking at a practical level, we're faced with, and this came up today, an issue of increasing freight flow on our roads. And also is it what Stephen Graham calls last mile issues, that, you know, sometimes it's okay getting something from China to Duisburg, but getting it from Duisburg into Düsseldorf is kind of the problem. And so you'll see in many Chinese cities where there's high densities, they're using these little cabs or little bike sort of delivery vehicles. And then of course there's a lot of research into different mobility systems that might help alleviate some of these freight backups. And then so we did a quick project on, interestingly enough, Chicago built an underground freight tunnel system in 1907. It was never really used for what it was intended. And so what we thought was, the green is the extents of this freight tunnel that still exists. It's 40 feet below the ground of the city. And so what we did was, there it is. I have a few successive images here. What we did was, this is the FedEx and UPS hubs that exist in Chicago. So they're almost touching the freight system. And so it didn't take an awful lot of work to connect them. And so now you have a completely integrated underground delivery conduit. This diagram over here, which is sliding off the frame, is a kind of conveyor system that would be retrofitted into the tunnel. All the packages are GPS controlled anyway, so they can be down there on their own. And then you start to divide the city up into half-mile delivery zones. And each of those half miles would get a little elevator down to the freight system. And then in fact, actually, to make it super efficient, you only need to use maybe a quarter of the existing system to do what you want to do. And then you start to look at, again, leveraging the logistical program for other stuff. So if you're going to pick up a package, why can't you get a zip car? Why can't you, or hire a bike? Why can't you, FedEx now takes your luggage to the airport for you. So you're piggybacking on other programs to make an industrial facility more public. These are completely washed out. I'm just going to skip. These were floor plans for the system. This is what it might look like. And then these are kind of different graphic surfaces that starts to kind of program the surface of this facility. And I had renderings and I forgot them. This is a project that looks at Michigan Avenue in Chicago and looking at we have a little bit of problem with sort of vacant storefronts. I don't know what it's like in Düsseldorf. It's kind of strange that the kind of revitalization of the American city in the early 1980s was all based on ground floor retail. You know, that you would have like retail on the ground, apartments above, and that would save the city, and everyone would suddenly move back into the city. You would have active streetscapes, and now you have a lot of vacant real estate because local stores can't compete with online commerce. And so this project became about identifying, these are different classifications of retail, identifying what retail is going away, and if it's going away, what's going to replace it. And so and then what happens to the streetscape? Do you know what I mean? The street is going to change when the kind of commercial role of the street, like the fundamental public space of the city, changes. And this is just speculating. You can see these on the website. This was Bloomingdale's is a vertical mall on Michigan Avenue. It's kind of struggling. There's a lot of vacant real estate in it, and it became this kind of recreational facility that became a kind of, it was modeled on the fact that Amazon are now opening actual stores. I don't know if you have them in Germany. They're actually opening bookstores. And so the kind of, that these logistical companies are coming full loop and now have a physical space, and so that they might kind of occupy this. And just starting to look at what do these interiors and what does the streetscape look like. I have one more, I'm at an hour, I said I'd finish in an hour. This is called Hijack. This is, I think supposedly, this is at the Dutch Pavilion at the Venice Biennale this year that just opened. It looks actually really interesting because it's embracing all of these logistical systems under the theme of work, body, leisure, and looking at different production, looking at automation actually in industry and what lessons we can learn there. But there, the pavilion was subcontracted out into 5 mini exhibitions in the pavilion, and one is being curated by actually Goldsmith's Matthew Stewart. I don't know if you know him. I think he teaches at Goldsmiths now, and he found, it's fantastic, all the patents that Amazon have taken out. And the patents are all single page, really dry drawings. You know, a patent document has very strict rules about how it's drafted, how many words on the sheet. And they threw these patents, there was like something like 150 of them out, open call. Okay, can you sort of rethink some of these patents or screw around with them or hijack them or sort of leverage them to do something else? And so we became interested in a couple of them in this document that they made.
Sorry, what's a patent?
A patent.
Patent.
Sorry. And so these are patents that Amazon have in the works. This one was for an inflatable data center. we weren't interested in the data center, we were interested in this kind of quickly inflatable system. The other one are these, I mean, these are terrible. These are like little cages on a robot. So this is the Kiva robot that Amazon uses, and it has sensors, and there's tags embedded in the floor of the warehouse, and so the robot follows directions. And these are little cubicles for the employees. So you would sit at your desk in this cage, but it saves you walking around, like the warehouses, the Amazon warehouse in, no, well, it's not in, is it, where was it, Kaplan, where are we today? Where was that city? Krefeld. There's an Amazon warehouse somewhere near there. It's like the size of 17 soccer fields. And so this is a mechanism that you could do some work and kind of move around the warehouse all at the same time. So, so we're like, well, what could we kind of do with those? And at the same time, I'd been reading, and this plays into Sergio's Freelancer. We'd been playing into, you know, there's a new convention now. It's kind of gig economy, younger people, kind of maybe people that have been in sort of the financial industry, have some money, so they'll decide, okay, we want to go live in, you know, the Amazon for 3 months, but we're going to do some work, and there's websites that you can go on and you can find other people that want to do the same. So it's kind of like not a vacation, it's like you're in a different area, but you're also doing work, and so there's really good infrastructure and Wi-Fi in these facilities. And so we said, well, how come, could we use some of these facilities to kind of build these, what we call terminals for the digital nomad, where these would be designated facilities, and they would be located in cities, they would be located, you can't see this, in forests, they would be located on the edge in the Arctic, or they would be located in sort of picturesque rural areas. And that you would then, courtesy of an app, you would sign on and you'd say, oh, I want to go to the one in Singapore. And then this is a kind of, tells you how you would get there, how you would live when you get there. I'm just going back to that image. And so this is just an example of one of these stations with these inflatable sort of communal live-work areas. The little cages are sort of like little mobiles that you could move around this like nomadic city and also do your work, because you're working all the time. It's playing into the kind of, you know, you're working all the time, and you get to kind of, I mean, the idea is that you actually would end up getting to meet people here, and then if you got sick of being in this place, you would then move to the next one. And then this is kind of like a zoom. So this is, actually we use more patents. This is like a kind of tagged surface that they use in an Amazon warehouse. So that's what the robots are reading to move or to navigate. This is one of these deployed inflatable, which is a kind of live workspace. And then you can see the cages, which some of them are funny, some of them have these like armatures for picking stuff up. But again, trying to be kind of a little tongue-in-cheek or a little bit kind of funny about how to deploy the system. So supposedly that this was selected and is in the Dutch pavilion. I haven't heard from anyone, so whether it's there or not. But I think they picked a selection of these for their project. And I think I'm going to leave it there. This is just the kind of credits for the book and all the people that helped out on it. Students, funding. Book was published by Berghauser. My editor was from Berlin, Ria. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Claire. I I thought it was quite interesting that you started with we have to rethink the city, saying you are a landscape architect, and that would be also my question, because you mentioning the city, but you speaking about Ryanair in the book, and also I would say edge city things. So you go very, in my opinion, very far out, and now with the concrete questions, you come very close to the city again, but definitely in a more infrastructural way. And you showed, and maybe just to explain what you saw, this kind of big office. It was Bertelsmann, which I think a lot of us know, the Bertelsmann Buchclub, which a lot of people know. Your floor plan from Gütersloh. And that they invented a kind of incredible pre-Amazon electric system, maybe not so much electronic, and that just underground, I think they had the trucks, huh? As far as I remember. So I think it would be interesting, or for our interest was very much how could we think of an urban logistic perspective, which, as you proposed, is not that it is just a solution as a building, but more like a structural approach. And we see on the other side that we have a reuse, and you said also from the storefronts, that we see in Berlin, they took a former media market, and now it's the Amazon Prime delivery house, or the Zalando, which is the German Amazon, took over a warehouse, and etc. So we see enormous changes, disruptive changes. So it would be interesting, from my perspective, how you beyond your drawings, how you read it in, let's say, on what already is starting. Because you said you might speak about the urban logistics of Amazon. It would be interesting what you already read and see, and how it, in a way, change the cities. If you like to elaborate on that, it would be very interesting.
Well, I think you're right. Online, I mean, e-shopping, the curve is going up, and I think it's going to keep going, whether we like that or not. And there's going to be a lot of empty real estate in cities. And so maybe at the super scale, I don't know what percentage of a city is, residential is X%, retail is X%, institutional is but I mean, there is a kind of shrinking of the city in one way, because we don't need all of these spaces. And so the question is, you either get rid of them. In certain areas you can't do that because they're the inner fabric of the city. So you start to think about reusing them. And Hannah, who's not here, who again got the taxi back with us, was talking about a project, I think it was in Vienna or somewhere, where somebody had the idea to kind of distribute a hotel into vacant storefronts. So instead of going to, the kind of Ibis in one building, the notion of distributing program around the city as a way to kind of fill up vacant space, I think is very interesting. The other thing is, at a very practical level, I said, is dealing with traffic. Do you know what I mean? And I know that all of these companies are even way ahead of us in kind of thinking about the future, whether it's drones or robots. But I think that's kind of, that last mile is really interesting. Where for me it's where the global meets the kind of, is at your doorstep. You know what I mean? I think there's a lot of room for kind of, and I think that, I didn't mention driverless cars because that's a whole other kind of category, but even, the zip car, or whatever you have here phenomenon, that changes, and perhaps that might be more transformational in the US city that's more auto-reliant than the European city. But that could have really very productive transformations in the American city. You know what I mean? So some of this is good. You know what I mean? If it's sort of presented in a kind of productive way. You know what I mean? I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you very much. And I think it was also coming back to the question between the built environment and the space of flows. I think it was very striking also your images of the air flight that you can really see US and you see where the let's say the punctuation of the big cities and also the Philadelphia example that through the flow of traffic you imagine a city. So it is in a way highly involved. Yeah, there's already a question. Great. Thank you.
Yeah. Is it okay to pose a question right now or to say something?
Yes, maybe ihr könnt auch gerne auf Deutsch fragen. Ich kann es auch gerne übersetzen.
Ja.
Es sollte keine Hemmnis sein.
I try to say something in English. Or should I, for the audience, perhaps try in German and then we...
No.
Okay. I just wanted to say first...
I'm joking.
Okay. So at first just thank you very much because I'm really fascinated as well from the lecture, but also I read your book in preparation for the weekend and there are really there are really many points I'd like to since I am a theater scholar and we are in a theater context here, I just focus one point because in the lecture again you talked about choreography. You mentioned the word choreography and this is I think really interesting because I think what logistics really does, it's not just metaphorical to think about dancing there and choreography because it's a question of rhythms, of waves, of in a way really of dancing. Also the guy today in the DHL center, he said everything has to be moving in every minute. So, and I think the logics of the older working culture that was much more mechanical. Yeah, there you could do some strikes, there you could have a kind of interruption of the process. And we all struggle today with the point that this old logic doesn't really work anymore. The kind of resistance that was breaking the process. Huh? I mean, if you really try today, it's like you would try to make a hole into the ocean. Into the waves of the ocean. And there was a long critical tradition in theater and also in the arts in the 20th century that always said critique is about interruption. And now we are really at another point, I think. Perhaps critique now and resistance now is much more the point of not breaking the waves, but leading them together or against each other. Perhaps also organizing a shitstorm or something like this. And
it's like Malcolm Gladwell, he talked about what was it, the Iraq War, you know, the first kind of activism, internet activism. You know, there's on the other side, there's enormous possibility though with the individual to corrupt, hijack, contaminate.
Yeah, but perhaps as a kind of a dancer, this is my point. Perhaps you talk about the shift from figure to flow. Perhaps it's a shift also from actor to dancer. It's also the shift from reader to scanner for us in the 20th century to the 21st century. And now perhaps I really, I was so struck when I saw that you came to the idea of an amphitheater there in your architectural approach. And so I just wanted to ask now, what brought you to this idea of an old ancient amphitheater? Because this is something I'm working in the field of theater. Because there you always have the point of the chorus as the other figure to the protagonist. And the chorus really has to do with all the questions we are trying to understand now, I think. And I was really fascinated that you then had this idea of the amphitheater there.
I think that was, I mean, Thank you for your rereading of that from your perspective. I guess in that case, the amphitheater was more of a symbol of a kind of historical typology of public space in the city, and that by sort of again merging, you know, sort of long-standing ways of us socializing together with new hybrid forms of information, that something new happens, you know. So maybe the logistical city is not a completely new entity, but it can merge historical typology and new ways of operating. And for me, that's when it gets interesting, you know what I mean? And also too, I think, you know, just as a project, I think we still have to look for the collective in the urban environment. Like, we live in a hyper-atomized world, hyper-individualized world, and it becomes difficult to, you know, sort of find the collective or reclaim the collective. And I suppose the amphitheater there was a kind of a symbol of the collective in that scenario. And so, yeah, all is not lost, that we can still come together. Even if the protagonist-audience relationship is not perhaps physical actor and audience, but is Instagram feed and audience, or whatever one is scrolling on the phone.
Thank you very much for this lecture. And I think I would have several questions, but just to focus on one aspect. What is actually, or what do you think is actually happening to the public space? You just mentioned it with this the arena. And in relation to this, what I found very interesting, you mentioned the logistical subject. What might that be? This
You and all of us, I think, in terms of the first question, again, you know, my context, I suppose, is the American city, where there has been a shift away from public space. I mean, there's a lot of privatization of cities now. And of course, the kind of history of the American city, where, you know, in the 50s and 60s, you know, everyone moved out of the city. It's taken, you know, you look at all the major cities in the US in the 70s and 80s, and they weren't good places to live. So the idea of public space in the American city has been very problematic in the last 50 or 60 years. I'm actually very optimistic that technologies or these network systems can reinvigorate public life in the city in completely new ways, some of which we haven't even kind of grasped around. And they do involve a kind of hybridization of network technologies and physical space. But I see, I'm very optimistic that these networks might solve some of the problems we've had with public space, at least in the American city. That's the first thing. I still think, despite all, you know, the kind of, the relationship between public and private, I think, is breaking down a little bit more with technology. Like, you work at home, or you go to Starbucks to work, or go to whatever cafe, I'm just using names. The separation between domestic life and public life is changing, but that might be good for the city too, because it means people are coming out to do a lot more things. And so typologies, like what was considered public space or private space, is kind of dissolving. And I think that's good too. You know, that's that means that there's new ways to inject intensity in the urban environment. So we just have to be very mindful of when there's new developments in your cities. Do you know what I mean? There are some visionary ways to think about the public realm in those developments.
What about the control, for example? Like controlling the public space, not the private space, and it's even more controlled.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, everything you do now is, it's like it's the elephant in the room. It's like, I don't know how you get around that. I mean, unless you start to set up free, sort of anti-network zones in the city. Do you know what I mean? That people, this zone is you can't bring any technology, or it's a rural kind of wild landscape conceptually in the city. But I don't know what to say about the control thing. It's a big problem, but it's not going away, and I don't have an answer to that actually. But except to say I'm very optimistic about public space in this era,
I was just wondering what you are observing is happening in the US at the moment with city centers, because in most European cities, the center of the town, used to be the church, and then in US cities, it became the big shopping center or the mall where everyone gathered and everyone was talking, meeting friends, etc. So I was wondering what you think now that shopping malls are becoming emptier and closing down. I know you've already said this idea that there might be hotels opening up in retail spaces, for example. But I was wondering what kind of developments have you seen happening? What will be the new center of town? Because American cities are so based on commercial retail transactions as the center of town, if they even have a center, if it's not just a drive-through. So I was just wondering what your observations are.
I think if you look at the transformation of the downtown into tourist-themed, generators of money. I mean, it's happening in Chicago. I mean, it's happening in a lot of American cities. That's a problem. I was just going to say something else got out of my mind. So you'll have a lot of industrial land, that was in downtown areas in American cities is now being flipped, and it's used for recreation and entertainment and experience generating economies. And so I think a lot of retail, even the whole logic of retail, I'm thinking of the Nike store, where it's presumed you're not going to buy something, you're just going there to watch sports movies or to embrace the kind of lifestyle around that brand. I think there's more and more of that kind of retail. I don't know what I just call it experience generating economy. And I think that's happening a lot in downtowns, both as a kind of form of commercial activity, but also as a form of recreational activity. And that's happening a lot at the moment. I think Richard Florida writes about that a lot, the kind of theming of downtowns. And it's really for tourism. It's not for the people who live in those cities, because the people who live in a city don't really live in those kind of urban areas. They live out in the kind of periphery of the city. So there's a kind of an even greater sort of polarization of downtown and the rest of the city, both in terms of economy, and we're seeing it in a lot of kind of the moneyed classes versus you know, lower working classes areas in cities, there's a huge polarization. Like New York is the quintessential example. Manhattan is a kind of playground for a certain elite, and then, you know, if you can't participate in that, you go to Bushwick. She used to live in Bushwick. And that's, yeah, I mean, that's a structural problem that we have to deal with. It's almost beyond architecture, do you know what I mean?
I would like to put my question in German.
Okay.
Sie haben dieses Diagramm mit diesen Knotenpunkten gezeigt. Von den Informationen, Datenknotenpunkte über die Welt gezogen und so weiter. Es sind ja innerhalb eines Landes auch Datenknoten. Kann es jetzt passieren, dass zum Beispiel eine datenmäßig unterentwickelte Gegend, wie zum Beispiel MacPommer, dass da die Leute nach Berlin ziehen, weil sie in ihrem eigenen Bundesland kein schnelles Datennetz haben? Denn das wird ja dort nicht aufgebaut oder dauert Jahrzehnte.
I tried to translate. He referred to your data net, and there are not only dots but a lot of holes sometimes. And he referred to a very rural, very remote area where there's hardly any data connections. So he asked, do they have to move to Berlin to get that kind of connection, or the other way around? What do we do with non-connected areas? I hope that was the correct translation.
Mm-hmm. Well, no is the answer. We do not have to move to Berlin. I mean, the promise of the network revolution was that you didn't have to go to Berlin. You could be in the wild and in the rural, and the belief that there would be a completely distributed world. Now, maybe we haven't got to the point where it's 100% distributed, but I would argue there is no rural anymore. I mean, everything is urban. You know, it might not be high-rise city urban, but conceptually, it seems as that there's complete, total urbanism, is that Neil Brenner's term. And so I think the problem is there isn't enough rural, you know, a network space left.
But please, okay, you see.
Is that answering?
You have a bar.
Yes. I'm often in Berlin and I'm often in Brandenburg.
Okay.
And to Brandenburg, the young persons, they don't want to live in Brandenburg because they have no fast internet. They can't use their handies, they can't use their computers because the net, sometimes they have holes in some areas, and on other areas it's so elastic speed. And is it then possible that through this vacuum in Brandenburg, as an example, the people werden nach Berlin gesaugt?
Yeah, so the people are stuck to Berlin because of these holes, and he's absolutely right, it is a big problem. So
Really?
we are not. We have a big discussion in
And why is that?
German
Because
government.
these areas, they're
They
not
don't care.
rural, they're just what they are, more impoverished areas, and nobody wants to put the infrastructure there.
Our telecoms are not interested in investing in remote areas where they have not enough customers, and government for, I would say, 10 years now promise you get speed internet, and a lot of companies also say, I cannot work with this slow connection, or I have to pay thousands of euros to get my own connection. Yeah, it's not distributed
Equally.
absolutely not. So it is a problem.
It is a problem, yeah.
And I would like to connect, because you on the other side said about Sears, and I think that was also what opened my eyes. They were connecting the rural to the city. So you could get, and we know that also from Bayerische Wald, where the Quelle-Katalog was the kind of promise, where you can get all these promising notes from the city by mail order. So we were maybe even further away, further closer by mail,
Yes.
by mailing it. But now we are for some it is really a problem to order or to get any services. Yeah. So that's the situation which we face.
Yeah, no, I mean, no, you're right. I mean, now I understand. Yeah.
So I would say beyond saying that I understand your image of a lot of things are city-like. Maybe we don't have a rule when it comes to digital service, but I would say other services too. If you look on school, on all that, we see how it is divided. And our old Federal Republic, West Germany, had a promise: you shouldn't drive further on than, I think, 20 kilometers to have the next highway. That was the idea of connectivity. And I think this idea is gone. We have a divided country. So I think that's why he...
I mean, I've been looking at, I'm just writing a short essay on new retail environments. This might not answer the question, but might just offer up something. And looking at, actually it's a Swedish company who are making an automated store, but it's like a kind of it's like a product design. It's not really, it doesn't fall under architecture. And it has wheels, and the whole premise is in maybe rural parts of Sweden that are perhaps similar and not connected, that a town or a small village could buy one of these vehicles, and you program it to what everybody wants, and it's a driverless, cashierless, and it can drive to a depot or a warehouse and get stocked up, and then drives back, and can even drive to people's homes because you're telling it what to do. Now you still need internet to kind of access the system, but I'm trying to just kind of find examples of smaller scale mobile systems that might kind of make a more equal distributed kind of system.
I think what I liked, what I like much, and I think that you speak about, I think it's a kind of black box logistics, and you also said it today. We were so lucky to get into the system and see how it works. I think it needs a lot of imagination and the graphics in that book, which is also super helpful to understand how it works and how we can deal with that, and how maybe we can intervene or criticize. So what are you heading on? Because I saw a lot of images that were not included in the book. Is there a kind of second book where you're heading to, or could you say something about what could be the next thing?
There could be a second book, but I don't know. I'm at a point where you can keep doing research. I mean, Amazon is fascinating. I mean, it's terrible and fantastic all at the same time. And you can get seduced, do you know what I mean? And it's changing all, I mean, these systems are so quick. So you can, you read another Economist article, or it's a struggle to keep up. But after a while, it's the research isn't really the important thing. It's really understanding, sort of at very tangible, close levels where the research and the systems, as I say, hit the ground or really kind of change the way we do things. And so I'd like to move to find more of those examples and to understand those examples and perhaps do more design work. Because after a while, writing, you're like the hamster on the wheel. Do you know what I mean? And I think you have to pursue it through another medium. So yeah, more design projects and trying to find a kind of more real world application for the research. But I don't know where that is. I mean, so that for me the book is, it's not just the logistical information. For me, what I think the book is most valuable for is a kind of methodology to think about the city. And, you know, there are alternative models that we can think about as a way just to ask new questions or to think about things differently. And I think that's what logistics really is to me at the end of the day. And so maybe there'll be another model I'll find, and it, you know, won't be, I mean, but you have to, the director of our school in Chicago says you can't fall in love with your own research because then you're doomed. Do you know what I mean? Then you can't see out of it. And so I'm mindful of that. But like at the moment, I'm doing a design project. It was a competition and I was shortlisted for the phase 2, looking at older logistical systems like post-industrial networks. So the Erie Canal in Upper New York State was the first canal in the US built in 1825 that basically linked the Hudson River to the Great Lakes. It meant that you could go from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico on a waterway. Fantastic engineering, great, you know, sort of really, really amazing. But now that waterway, it's 520 miles long. It's not used for commercial traffic anymore. A lot of the towns that grew up on the canal are like holes in the system. Very impoverished communities, not much economy, and so the state is trying to kind of, how do we rethink the infrastructure of the canal, you know, as a new logistic to stimulate economy in these, and they're pretty towns, but there's nothing happening there. And so that's an idea for me of a project that is still thinking about logistics, but not in a very literal way. And you know, even there, trying to think about new forms of public space that might combine new industries and economies in certain sections of the canal. So that's kind of, you know, that's why I'm fascinated with this kind of area, and you know, the talk this morning about the old industrial areas now being kind of claimed as part of the city, and how do we rethink those as territories in the city? So that for me is a logistical project. So maybe thinking more broadly about logistics is always tied to economy, it's always tied to some sort of exchange, you know, in the city, and so that might be a way to move forward. We'll see.
Is that a question? No. If there's no totally urgent question, I think we need something to drink. It's quite humid here. Thank you very much for your lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you for the discussion. Come back tomorrow because we will go with the flow from the logistics to the questions of the city and how, because even in the cities there's a lot of holes, and problems or conflicts. So tomorrow we will, in a way, go much deeper into more urban questions and leave a bit the logistic track. I'm sure not forever, but for tomorrow. And thank you very much for summing it up. We had a long day. We had a lot of things we heard, bombarded, I would say. So we have to digest it, and maybe with a beer. Thank you very much.
That sounds good.